Survival stories are supposed to be about rugged men, soldiers, explorers, mountaineers, not sheltered teenage noblewomen who've never even dressed themselves without assistance. But Marguerite de La Rocque shattered every expectation. In 1542, Marguerite was wealthy, educated, and completely unprepared for hardship when she was abandoned on a remote island off the coast of Canada that terrified sailors so much they called it the Isle of Demons. And the man who left her there wasn't some notorious criminal or rival royalty, it was her own uncle. And his reason? Apparently she had fallen in love with the wrong person. Although, as we'll see later, it's possible he used that as cover to hide an even darker motivation. By the time fishermen found her, nearly 2 years later, everyone who had been marooned with her was dead. But Marguerite had miraculously adapted to thrive in the harsh environment, trading her silk dresses for a bearskin cloak, having transformed from aristocrat to hunter, from pampered noblewoman to lone survivor. This is the true story of a woman who showed what humans are capable of when everything they know is taken away. In the early 1540s, Marguerite de La Rocque was around 18 years old and living the privileged life of French nobility. She owned substantial lands in Périgord and Languedoc and was co-seigneuress of Pontpoint, impressive titles that marked her as a woman of wealth and status. Her world was one of chateaux and servants, formal gardens and social obligations, which makes what happened next all the more remarkable. In 1541, her uncle Jean-François de La Rocque de Roberval was appointed Lieutenant General of New France by King Francis I. The following year, he organized an expedition to establish a French colony in what would eventually become Canada. And for reasons that historians still debate, Marguerite decided to join him on this voyage. Think about this choice for a moment. Ocean voyages in the 16th century were dangerous, uncomfortable affairs. Ships were cramped, disease-ridden vessels where privacy was non-existent. The journey itself took months, and the destination? A largely unexplored wilderness where European settlements had repeatedly failed. Why would a woman of Marguerite's standing choose this? Some historians suggest she was swept up in Canada fever. At this time, heroic explorers were returning with tales of opportunity that captured the imagination of the French public. Others propose a darker possibility, that Roberval, who was heavily in debt from his lifestyle as a court favorite, deliberately encouraged his wealthy relative to join him, perhaps already plotting to eliminate her and claim her inheritance. Whatever her reasons, Marguerite boarded her uncle's ship in the spring of 1542, accompanied only by her maidservant Damiens. Both had no idea the horrors that were in store for them on this journey. Life aboard a 16th century sailing vessel was a test of endurance even in the best circumstances. Passengers and crew lived in cramped quarters with minimal privacy. Food was preserved with salt and often rancid. Fresh water turned stagnant. Storms could strike without warning. But it was in these unlikely surroundings that the teenage Marguerite found love. The identity of the man remains one of history's secrets. In Queen Marguerite of Navarre's account, written years later, he's described as a common laborer, but historians believe this was a deliberate misdirection to protect the reputation of what was likely a young nobleman's family. His name was never recorded in any historical document. He exists in history only as Marguerite's unnamed lover. Their affair could not remain secret for long in the confines of a ship. Roberval eventually discovered them together. As a strict Calvinist known for his moral rigidity, he was outraged by what he saw as scandalous behavior that brought dishonor to their family name. But was moral outrage his only motivation? Or was it all a grand scheme for Roberval to alleviate his significant debts? Marguerite's substantial lands and wealth would solve his financial problems if she were no longer in the picture. The stage was set for one of history's cruelest acts of abandonment. As the expedition sailed along the coast of what is now Newfoundland, they approached a desolate, rocky island, a place so feared by European sailors that it appeared on maps marked as the Isle of Demons. According to legend, the island was haunted by evil spirits whose howls could be heard from the shore. In reality, these were likely the sounds of wind through rocky crevices, seabird colonies, and perhaps distant walruses. But to 16th century sailors, these unfamiliar sounds reinforced their fears. Roberval intentionally chose this notorious island to carry out his cruel act. What happened next depends on who you ask. One version comes from Queen Marguerite of Navarre. And no, not the same Marguerite. It was just a common name back then. This Marguerite was a queen who loved to write and had likely heard about the survival story through royal gossip. It was that shocking. In her version, Marguerite's lover was put ashore first as punishment for his romance with her, and she chose to join him out of love, a romantic act of devotion. But a second account from historian André Tevet, who claimed to have heard it directly from Marguerite herself, flips the roles. In his telling, she was abandoned first, and her lover dove off the ship and swam to be with her. Either way, they ended up marooned together. Oh, and her maidservant was also left for good measure, and things only got worse from there. Either way, the result was the same. Marguerite, her lover, and her loyal maidservant Damienne were left on the island with minimal supplies, a few weapons, some basic tools, a Bible, and little else. Roberval's ship disappeared over the horizon, leaving them to what he likely assumed would be certain death. Imagine Marguerite's feelings in that moment. The betrayal by her own blood relative, the terrifying uncertainty of survival on an island rumored to be haunted, and the crushing realization that everything she had known, comfort, security, status, was gone in an instant. They were about to be pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. The small group managed to find shelter in a cave and began the work of survival, gathering what food they could, hunting small game with their limited ammunition, and preparing for winter. But the harshness of the North Atlantic climate proved overwhelming. As winter set in, Marguerite's lover fell ill. With no medicines and inadequate shelter and nutrition, his condition deteriorated rapidly. In the depths of winter, he died, the first of 3 deaths that would leave Marguerite entirely alone. But their ordeal was just beginning. The ground was frozen too solid for burial. In a particularly haunting detail recorded in historical accounts, Marguerite kept her lover's body in their shelter until spring, using her gun to ward off scavenging animals that were drawn to it. Try to imagine the psychological toll of this situation, grieving while literally having to defend the body of your loved one day after day. When spring finally came, Marguerite and Damienne were able to dig a grave. But by this time, another challenge had emerged. Marguerite was pregnant. Damienne, already weakened by the harsh winter, grew increasingly frail. Before Marguerite gave birth, her faithful servant, her last connection to her former life, also died. Somehow, alone on the island, Marguerite delivered her child. For a brief time, she had a new companion in her isolation, but the infant, born into such desperate circumstances, survived only a matter of days. Marguerite had to bury her baby alongside her lover and maid. Now she was completely alone. This is where Marguerite's story transcends ordinary survival tales. Consider what she was facing: total isolation on a remote island, the psychological trauma of having lost everyone close to her, including a newborn child, with winter approaching again and supplies dwindling. For most people, especially someone raised in the sheltered environment of the 16th century French aristocracy, this would have been the end. But something remarkable happened. Marguerite adapted. She transformed. The noble women who had likely never prepared a meal in her life learned to hunt and fish. She, who had been dressed by servants, now crafted clothing from what was available. Historical accounts tell us she shot a bear, skinned it herself, and wore its fur to stay warm during the brutal winter months. Yet, perhaps most fascinating are the small ways she maintained her humanity and sanity. According to some accounts, she continued to observe certain civilized rituals even when completely alone. She would dress for dinner. She would set a place at her makeshift table. These weren't signs of delusion. They were deliberate acts of maintaining her identity and dignity in the face of circumstances that threatened to strip away her humanity. And this wasn't a brief fluke of luck. For more than 2 years, Marguerite survived alone on the notorious Isle of Demons that haunted rugged sailors' dreams. She endured isolation that would break most people. She faced the harsh elements, wild animals, starvation, and the psychological burden of complete solitude. And somehow, she held on. In 1544, a fishing vessel exploring the coastline spotted something rather unexpected. A European woman dressed in animal skins, alone on an island where no one should have been. The fishermen, likely Basque or Portuguese, were astonished to find a French noblewoman living in these conditions. They rescued Marguerite and took her first to their settlement in Newfoundland, and eventually arranged passage for her back to France. When she returned, her story spread quickly. She became something of a celebrity, a woman who had experienced something beyond the imagination of most Europeans. But here's where Marguerite's story takes another fascinating turn. Rather than simply returning to her previous life of aristocratic privilege, she chose a different path. She founded a school for girls and settled in the town of Nontron, living in the Château de la Motte. The woman who had been forced to reinvent herself on the Isle of Demons now dedicated herself to education, perhaps seeing in young women the potential for the same strength and adaptability she had discovered in herself. And what about Roberval, the uncle who had abandoned her? His fate carries its own ironic justice. In 1560, during a time of brutal religious conflict in France, he was attacked by a Catholic mob while leaving a Protestant meeting in Paris, beaten to death in the street. A violent end for a man who had once wielded his power so cruelly. I'm sure you're all devastated. Marguerite's extraordinary story has inspired writers and artists for centuries. Queen Marguerite of Navarre, remember, different Marguerite, included it in her collection of tales called the Heptameron in 1558. André Thevet recounted it in his Cosmography in 1575. In more recent times, novels, plays, poems, and even a few lesser-known films and creative works inspired by her story. Yet despite this, her story remains surprisingly unknown to many people today. Perhaps this is because it defies easy categorization. It's a survival story, yes, but also a tale of betrayal, of forbidden love, of transformation, and ultimately of creating meaning from suffering. What makes Marguerite's story so powerful is not just that she survived physically, but that she maintained her humanity in the face of isolation and loss that would destroy most people. She transcended the limitations of her aristocratic upbringing and discovered capacities within herself that she likely never knew existed. And her story raises questions that resonate across the centuries. What are we capable of when everything is taken away? Can profound suffering lead to equally profound transformation? Marguerite de La Rocque, noblewoman, castaway, survivor, educator, reminds us that even in our darkest moments, when we are most alone, the human spirit can find ways not just to endure, but to transform. Her voice echoes to us across nearly 5 centuries with a simple but powerful message. We are capable of more than we know. And sometimes the most unlikely people leave behind the most unforgettable legacies. If stories like this resonate with you, consider subscribing. We share true tales of survival, grit, and human resilience every week. And if you found Marguerite's journey as powerful as we did, a like goes a long way.